Good afternoon. I'd like to begin by conceding that unlike so many other of the scholars you're hearing from today, I'm not a scholar of literature, let alone of Arabic literature. My academic training is in international relations. But as much probably as any other well-known writer, it was Ameen Rihani who inspired me, interested me, drew me into deeper study of the Middle East and the Arab world. So I feel very privileged to be here to return to some of my old stomping grounds in the Washington, D.C. region to reflect on the resilient mind and imagination of Ameen Rihani. So I'll start with a scene from the final pages of Ameen Rihani's pioneering novel, The Book of Khalid, the first English language novel written by an Arab-American author. The book, whose chief protagonist, Khalid, has followed a life trajectory similar in many respects to the author's own journey, concludes with dramatic and sobering setbacks. Having immigrated to America from Lebanon, pursued a free-range education of voracious reading, maddeningly eclectic at that, he's returned to the Levant to achieve an East-West cultural synthesis to promote reform, but he suffers one blow after another. He witnesses the apparent collapse of his political ambitions, as well as his personal hopes. After many chapters celebrating Khalid's growing realizations and mounting aspirations, the book ends on a somber note and invites the reader to speculate about what the author has himself concluded concerning the viability of programs of reform, efforts to reshape the landscape of Arabic thought and leave a mark on the world. Indeed, Khalid himself has disappeared into the desert, vanishing from the very landscape he had inspired to change. And yet, if we read closely, the picture is not unconditionally bleak, for Rihani has left the door open. He has disappeared some 10 days ago, reports Khalid's erstwhile companion Shakib, and I know not whither. The narrator then carries on, noting that in passing, Khalid continues to dream of, quote, appearance in the disappearance of sunrises in the sunset. So what are we to make of this character Khalid, whose dream of a dynamic, progressive, liberating, tolerant, and inclusive Arab nationalism has suffered a seemingly formidable reversal? Does this literary outcome signal Rihani's own awareness of profound obstacles to his large ambitions? Considered in the context of Rihani's other writings, it would seem that the Book of Khalid was an opportunity for Rihani to grapple with his own life story, his journey, his own navigation between the East and West, and the challenges facing some of his larger desires to see profound change effected. But if you know his other works, his cosmopolitan idealism articulated in The Path of Vision, his many pragmatic and still idealistic journeys through the Arab world, travelogues written in the 30s addressed to Arabic as well as English language readers, we know that his concern with these themes did not end with Khalid's occultation in the Egyptian desert. So let us fast forward. We jump forward 100 years, and perhaps the connections I'm going to make are too easy, but if we go to the landscape of present-day Middle East, where Khalid disappeared into the desert, and this is just a century after Khalid proclaimed, and these are Rouhani's words, an Arabian Spring in Damascus, we find some rather uncanny resonance. Had a now vanished Arab Spring activist from the 2011 Tahrir Square protests written the Book of Khalid, would it have ended any differently than Rihani did? And what sense would we have made of it? So a century after the Book of Khalid and other important writings, it remains possible to read Rihani as a very contemporary thinker. Far from being a distant or aloof literary figure, and despite the idiosyncrasies of his somewhat archaic language and obscure references, particularly in the Book of Khalid, Rihani has the capacity to speak to present-day readers concerned with challenges of our times. The urgency of profound change, the need for new and yet culturally and historically rooted value syntheses, the powerful inertia of existing systems and thought patterns, and even the seeming inevitability of disillusionment and profound questioning about the viability of progressive programs. I'd like to propose that just as there are revolutionary and transformative themes throughout Rihani's writings, you can also find realistic acknowledgement of challenges. Critique, and yet a sustaining affirmation that we don't have to live out tragic scripts, that even if in this novel there's a hint of them. So I've therefore organized my commentary for the symposium around a question. What was it about Rihani's thought and worldview that allowed him, in so many of his literary productions, to find and articulate hope in troubled times, to acknowledge the enormity of obstacles without succumbing to them? And it's indisputable that Ameen Rihani, together with contemporary writers like Gibran and Naimy, aspired to be iconoclastic, innovative, and even prophetic. Rihani's break with literary and conventions, break with tradition, went hand in hand with profound and persistent social critique, as well as the offering of an updated, reconstructive vision. In my own characterization of Rihani as a visionary and critical figure, I find it useful to highlight both the vital importance he placed on free thought as a basis for agency and social change, and also the emphasis he placed on positivity as part of an affirmative spirit which we persist in difficult times. For a young at heart or young person chafing at resistance to an established social order, the sclerotic and stifling character of political and economic institutions, at the reluctance of Eastern as well as Western cultural communities to construct and embrace inclusive and dynamic worldviews, Rihani's relatable, human, and sympathetic. He's uncompromising in his fundamental judging and analyses, and channeled the same desires as Naimy and Gibran to find some way of living that allowed them to reconcile the two worlds that they had experienced. Rihani, like Gibran and Naimy, insisted on trying to get the vision right, trying to draw sustenance from a vision that was not reflected on the ground around them. And they tried in their own rather pioneering journeys as immigrants to try to reconcile the contraries of their experiences, reconcile the different values, to satisfy their hunger for truth that could satisfy their sense of need for spirituality on the one hand, their need to take account of modern science, need to find some integrative vision where everything fit together, where they weren't having taboos imposed on them or told that something is off, out of bounds or off limits, whether it's the atheists and agnostics whom Rihani traveled with for a little while before saying, no, that's not for me. I can't not believe in God. I'm from Lebanon. Or whether it's East, where he's told that everything is prescribed. Everything that he's born into, he must follow. So Rihani, like his fellow visionaries, was disinclined to maneuver for modest changes and marginal gains. And it was a literary as well as political reformer who took audacious stances. Freedom of the spirit, he maintained, this is a quote, is the cornerstone of all freedom. So that's where he saw it beginning. Freedom of the spirit, freedom of thought, of critique. And I'd like to quote a bit from an essay from Rihani entitled, "Who Am I?", where Rihani talks about his cultural heritages and his effort to kind of reconcile this complexity of who he is as a person of broad experiences, a person that was a wide reader, curious, with an evolving and dynamic worldview. So quoting from the essay, "I do feel, nay, sometimes even am certain, that my personality is composed of multi-personalities, which are at once contrasting and akin. They are contrasting in form, yet akin in essence. From the standpoint of race, my personality is composed of Semitic and Aryan strains, thus Assyrian, Iranian, Greek, and Arab. From the view of religion, it is Baali, Adonistic, Unitarian, Christian, Muslim, and Sufi. From the point of view of literature, it is Eastern, Western, poetic, philosophical, and practical scientific." So he's saying, I don't want to negate anything that strikes me as true, or this part of my larger heritage. I'm not going to kind of define myself in a narrow way, exclude other things, define myself and contrast that, and reject part of reality. So this refusal to be domesticated and narrowed, or to live within rigid boundaries, to confine his human experience, inspired rebellion in Rihani, fired him with the conviction that needed social changes were only possible if people's minds could be expanded to embrace broader swaths of reality. And he believed it's possible to integrate the best of different cultures in a humanizing synthesis that would be good for Americans as well as for Arabs and other peoples. So he sought to define himself in both and terms. But returning briefly to the theme of freedom, back in 1935, an older Rihani than I quoted in that other essay on Who Am I, when he was very young, he was asked by students at the American University of Beirut to articulate his credo, and this is the short, epigrammatic answer he gave him. My goal in life, to do my utmost writing, speaking, and acting in order to free man, language of the day, from shackles of ignorance, poverty, and fear, to ease human suffering and dispel illusions and fallacies and beliefs and teachings in the realm of politics, society, and religion. Not too modest in his goals. My method of reaching my goal, freedom of thought, research, and expression, independent of all partisanship, prejudice, and personal leanings. So he practiced, one of the striking theme in Rihani that I find is he practiced multiple critique. And this is a theme that comes up a lot in contemporary discussions about Islam in the West, Middle East and America. You find lots of people who are unloving critics of one side and uncritical lovers of another. But Rihani practices critique going both ways. He also tries to practice what I call multiple affirmation, saying what's good, what can we identify, try to build up. And he saw both of these as vital for creative agency. But he firmly believed that all peoples have the capacity not just to be subjects of history, but to have collective agency and to act upon it. And in this, he really tried to build up within his worldview a strong and consistent thread of positivity, of sustaining affirmation. He refused to engage in the politics of devaluing the other. The truth, he maintained, is not an exclusive possession of any people. And when addressing Arab and as well as American audiences, he would invoke themes such as the following: when we go deep enough and high enough, we meet. Such positivity is not always well received. Yet according to reports of Rihani's demeanor and deportment, as well as records of his spoken and written words, it does reflect a fairly stable aspect of his personality as many people experienced it. In one of his poems, he professed a desire to live without disliking anyone. And as well as in an essay, he asserted that, quote, my innermost nature is free of bitter residues. These were at least his keynote, among his keynote aspirations. He was an admirer, he said, of American transcendentalists, European romantics, and Muslim Sufis. And he sought inspiration not just from texts, but also from nature. So he believed you could experience spirit through communion with the natural world, that this is accessible to everybody. We heard from Terry DeYoung about the Brooklyn Bridge part of Rihani's life experience. So I'd like to quote just briefly from another part of that essay where he talks about how when he would get beaten down by his life in New York City, we had kind of a love-hate relationship with New York, that he would go out on Brooklyn Bridge and walk in the elements and feel himself uplifted. So I'm going to edit quickly here, but he even in his other essays, he's wrestling with conflict, inequality, oppression, resistance to change, prejudice. He found his peace on Brooklyn Bridge. So for all your activity, noise, bustle, and traffic, I love you, New York. I love you even though you care not for the beautiful dreams of your poets. Edit, edit, edit. Rather, I love you solely for your great bridge. I walk to that bridge and barricade myself there whenever the forces of weariness and despair overwhelm me. I build my tents there. Between the two cities, I raise my flag. I gather around me a powerful army of light and air, an army so strong that clouds of anxiety disperse before it and the snows of unease melt in its face. I stand there victorious with the cold wind bringing out the pink hue in my cheeks. I stand right in the middle of the bridge above all the ships sailing beneath me. I stand surrounded by cars and trains, pedestrians from left and right. I stand there basking in my evident victory. The victory of the self over its troubles and the worries that cloud it. Walking and clean air are remedies in themselves. Walking the bridge aids in contemplation, and contemplation raises a person above the material world. Just 3 minutes, okay? Allowing him to unite with his maker, this union is craved by every dignified human self. Moving on, in my paper, I then moved to, after these themes of critique and affirmation, I moved to explore how Rihani had to wrestle with falling short of his aspirations to see certain changes in the world. He consistently returned to his same ideals. But he witnessed World War I. He lived to see the start of World War II. He saw as the Ottoman Empire withdraws from the Arab world, then the French and British empires take over. He saw Americans drifting towards a possible role of being drawn into the emerging vacuum in the region and being drawn into conflicts in the Middle East like Israel-Palestine. He tried to advocate magnanimously, creatively, nuanced, but persistently saying America has to try to find ways to partner with the self-determination of the Middle East and Arab world rather than get drawn in like other empires. So he was very futuristic and trying to build up the dignity of both of his audiences. But I've asked myself, how did he stay positive in seem like demoralizing times when things aren't going your way, when you want freedom and there's a new mandate system, et cetera? And there are various themes we can emphasize. He keeps talking about the role of the ideal in his writings. It's important to have an ideal, and that failure to fully manifest your ideal is not really failure. It's the greatest thing to have the privilege to try to be clear about what you stand for and try to humbly advance it. He also has a strong work ethic that he articulates in his writings. In a chapter of the book of Kahlil, he talks about what he learned from a companionable hermit in the mountains of Lebanon, who he thought, on one hand, what a wasted human existence. He's confined to this cloister, this vineyard, but yet he's so disciplined, and he works, and he has his ideal. What can I learn for that? He maintains this beautiful vineyard. What vineyard can I work in my own? How do I make my own small contributions and take responsibility for that and infuse that in my own ideas for social progress and change? So you see a strong theme of work ethic along with the ideal. You also see themes of detachment. One of his famous sayings is, say your word and go your way. Don't get your ego too involved in the reception of audiences. Know that if you want to be kind of radical or revolutionary, saying let's have big changes, not everybody's going to be warm to it. So he talks about not allowing oneself to be defined by one's critics, always responding to them. I wonder if he had a social media universe to engage in, would he stay off of certain platforms where you're always on the defensive and trying to tear people down? Would he try to, maybe he would just be a blogger, I'm not sure. We also can learn some lessons from Rihani on persistence, and as well as playful detachment. And this is a theme, if you want to, Todd Fine, in your introduction to the book, a critical edition of the book of Kahlil, Todd, who's here with us, has a thoughtful reflections on the playful quality in many of his writings, especially Book of Quality, which suggests he tried not to take himself too seriously and recognize that always appearing too earnest might turn off your audience. We have to live with a certain spirit of whimsy and play as well as seriousness. So these are some of the themes that I wanted to share with you today. A final one for Rihani is the importance of creative imagination. The human mind and imagination have the ability to see things differently. And that it is, I think Rihani, if he were with us today, he would say that, don't imagine that your ideas, your ideals don't matter even if the struggle is a harsh one. That it's always worthwhile to seek coherence and synthesis and not just and to infuse that into your commentary on the state of the world. Try to be a mediator between different truths, even while upholding strongly truths that you think are not getting the play that they require. And I think that even some of the East-West themes, though we might articulate them differently today, still relate to some fragmented aspects of people's experience in the world today that Rihani sought to bridge and unite. So I'll conclude with one of his poems on that theme. Perhaps there's still much we can learn from him. Here's a quote from one of his volumes.